My name's David Eldridge. I'm from Ballarat. My friends, or some of my friends in Ballarat, have asked me to ask the panel if I could mention and get a response about the trees on the highway between Ararat and Horsham, or between Ballarat and Horsham, that are being cut down at the moment. They're very old red gums, and some of you I know are aware of them. Amongst other things, and I dare say the people from Vic Roads feel that they're being bold in making the decision to remove them. But I'd just like the panel's opinion about how we value street trees in the country compared with in the urban landscape. Thanks.
Okay, I'll start. I was at Ararat talking about those trees on Wednesday evening with the local community. And I think the issue here is not that you want a better road, because most people do. Vic Roads always play the safety card. And I know John Hawker's here, I can't see him at the moment because of the lights, but John and I were both basically threatened over the Avenue of Honour at Ballarat by saying, would you give precedence to trees over human life? So I think the issue is that Vic Roads still doesn't give due recognition to the services and value of roadside vegetation. And as a consequence, when they do their planning and budgeting, these matters are not taken into account. And very often they have a view that the trees are just there, they don't put a dollar value on them, but everything else they do does have a dollar value. So the wire rope barrier that would allow you to have both the highway and the trees costs money, which may not be in their budget. Some of those trees, as you probably know better than I, were absolutely fantastic red gums. And some of you would literally weep if you saw the sorts of specimens that had been removed. In one instance, a tree was removed as a temporary measure. They needed temporary access, and this great big tree disappeared, basically because they needed 2 weeks access in that particular spot. So there are some strange things going on here. To be on a bit more positive about it, they do and have replanted many trees along their roadside, so they are taking that course. And I do think there's a change of attitude. I'll finish on this, John. What I find truly staggering is Vic Roads, like many of the road authorities in Australia, control significant open space and very large numbers of trees. Now those trees go a long way in terms of fixing carbon, providing environmental services that could be used to mitigate some of the production from the road users, either vehicular traffic. So it would be in Vic Roads' own interest, I think, from an environmentally sustainable perspective, to recognise that they have a major natural asset under their control, to value that asset and to understand the value of that asset against the issues of road construction costs and safety. And I'll finish by saying, many of you will perhaps know Jane Tarrant from the University of New South Wales, and some of our New South Wales colleagues here will remember that there was a study that suggested that lots of people killed themselves running into trees from the roadsides, and that as a consequence all the trees should be removed. And Jane presented the data for the number of trees that had been run into compared to the number of poles and fatalities, and wondered why no one had called for the removal of all the poles, because it would be much more logical to remove all the poles first and then come to the trees second. Now, I know that dodges your question a bit, but you get my point, and I'll be happy to talk to you over lunch.
Can I add to that briefly? Just the Avenues of Honour project, if you're aware of it, treenet.org or AGHS, would suggest that rural trees are increasingly valued and recognised, at least memorial ones, by the community. And I didn't bring it up on stage, but I could have read from New South Wales Roads a statement that suggests that they're embracing exactly what Greg's just said. Where they're recognised as heritage or picked up, they're prepared to factor them in. They haven't in the past. That's the problem.
Yeah, well, just on that, I mean, I know that there are folks in this audience, but we had a major battle over the Avenue of Honour at Bacchus Marsh, and some of the people in this room were powerful advocates in favour of retaining the trees. Interestingly enough, I thought the merits of our debate and argument were overwhelmingly strong, but the minister intervened to protect those trees from that work. And I can't remember, John Dwyer could probably remember date and day. I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago that we were before the panel up at Bacchus Marsh. And you know, those proposals are still quite active, and I'd be astonished if we don't end up in another battle over those trees. And my memory is that we've battled over the Bacchus Marsh trees in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the noughties, and I suspect we'll be battling over them again. And very often the gains are minuscule.
Tim? Well, I was just going to add, part of your question was about trees in the country being less valued as well, and I think that is true, and I made a flippant comment about cappuccinos and pizzas and things. That it's true that a tree, so many people see, and where those trees were, they were right below Parliament House, and it was a very public spot. Those trees became more important out of proportion to their significance than any other tree, in a country tree or a city tree. And I think that's, we do undervalue trees unless they're in a prime spot, and that was a good spot for the television cameras too. They only had to just drop around the corner. So there are advantages in protesting in the city. And but I think to me it does come down to the value of the tree and the value of that landscape, and making those assessments. And I don't think we do that well in the country. And I've lived in a lot of country towns, and there's been some wonderful old trees, but it tends to be less. I suppose sometimes it's just due to other things being more important in the country, particularly in older times when there are like living and surviving and all that kind of thing. But I think we make a mistake if we don't look after them.
And just to add something about the power of valuation and the great move and extra resources and research that's going on in that space, still valuing and putting the dollar value on is not the be all and end all. We've seen, even heard today that particularly when it comes to historic and cultural values, that they're still incredibly difficult to put the dollar value on. I think what's the message is there are a number of different tools, and sometimes the dollar value about property value, and sometimes the dollar value about carbon sequestration, and sometimes the dollar value about something else, and sometimes just the story that someone tells about their childhood or whatever, a relationship with the tree. All of it should come together and be put on the table. Yeah.
Don't forget my nippers bring council to its knees. Can I suggest also that the law, that point was made by, I think, John, that it's not about the merits of the case, it's about did they follow procedure? The law can be an ass. I mean, my first case in the Land and Environment Court in New South Wales, I was asked to repeat this statement that apparently buffer planting was an admission of bad design. You had something to hide. Could I repeat that? That was the first time the court had heard that. And you build something so ugly, you have to buffer it. Think about that.
Can I ask a question, Tony? Would you mind commenting on Lyndall's work and results? And would those results, the influence of street trees on property values, do you consider that planners and local councillors would be impressed, influenced by those results?
I think you find that the pressure on property values for trees is something you find in the older suburbs. The richer people in most Australian cities are moving into the Australian older suburbs, which are going up in value, because they tend to value them. Because in the older suburbs, the houses and the trees are there. The richer people are moving into them because they perceive. The problems that I was showing in my talk are all the new suburbs. And I explained the kind of financial process that's going on. People buy a plot of land. Once they bought the plot of land, they then are sold a house to put on that land. And it is not in the interest of the builder to have planted areas. They wouldn't have a front setback if the planners didn't insist on them, but they don't put much on it because the builder doesn't make any money out of trees. So, and they sell people the size of building. And I think there's a different kind of market. In the older suburbs, you're talking about existing the existing environment that people are buying. What you're reselling the houses.
Although a Chinese millionaire buying a house and a mansion at that in an older suburb of Sydney often demolishes every tree and buys the block next door and fills all of that up with 95% site coverage. So not necessarily always.
The other comment I could make on this, I do think, in answer to your question, John, that councils are interested, very interested, in these sorts of valuations. And I know, and I won't mention the council, but there is one council that is proposing to change its planning code to allow 2 small trees in the front and 1 large tree in the back of all new developments. And it's in response to the sort of work that Tony and Lyndall have done. I presented some evidence to that planning panel, and the issue here is this is a council obviously in the outer west and would not normally be seen as a trendsetter. But if they get this up, it could have a major impact on how other councils see their codes, and it will set a precedent for going away from the sort of the general statewide code. And there are a whole range of reasons why they're doing this, but one of them is for health, one of them is about temperature, another is about property values, and also about having an appropriate rating base into the future. So a whole range of things going into that. And I would anticipate that the outcome of that request to the Planning Board of Victoria would be out in the next 6 to 8 weeks. We've already been waiting 8 or 9 weeks. So yes, I think it does have an impact.
Thank you. My name is Murray Cook, a councillor with the Baw Shire in Gippsland, an hour and a half out of Melbourne, nice, clean and green. The hat that I'm wearing today, though, is chair of the Peri-Urban Group, which are 7 councils that ring Melbourne. And we're all facing the same challenge of the government sending a lot of people as residents to our area. And those challenges are many. What the Peri-Urban Group is interested in is a urban policy statement firmly placed within the state planning policy framework. And we need people's help to do that. And my question is along the lines of how do we get the government decision makers to help things like that actually take place. And as a councillor, I'd also mention that VCAT is the natural practical enemy of good planning outcome.
Well, how do you answer a question like that? My first comment is that you've got to know what you actually want. Do you remember that Paul Kelly song, Be Careful What You Ask For because you just might get it? And so, for example, I know that I mentioned in my talk that Brimbank City is looking to have 20% cover and going up from around 6%. Well, I reckon that's terrific, but I couldn't let them get away with it. Why isn't it 30%? And you say, well, why would you pick the 30% figure? Well, because there's a whole lot of data that says if you want to capture the climate change and environmental benefits, 30% is about as low as you can go. The figure that Melbourne City Council is aspiring to in their policy, and I'm sure this will be talked about after lunch, much better than I, but they're aspiring to 40%. Now, they didn't just sort of look at the map and think, geez, it'd look better with 40% green on it. That's not the way it worked. They actually said there is data. There are data out there. So that's what we want. So the first thing I think you want is to know what you're aspiring to. And I don't see why we shouldn't be aspiring at a statewide level for, in all built-up areas, 35% cover. Minimum, 40%. I like 35 because it's close to a third and people can do the sums. But why not go for that? And councils might aspire to achieve that in 20 years or 50 years. I don't give a hoot as long as they're aspiring and moving along that pathway. So that's the simplest thing that I can suggest. If we aspire to that aim, then a whole lot of other things flow from it. And one of the things that flows from it is if you want 35% cover, you have to provide the space. That then opens up your open space. It means that you're mandating how much of a property can be built on, and a whole range of things ensue from having a simple, clear and achievable policy, in my view.
Yeah, I think you certainly need to start with the evidence. I mean, I have a strong bias towards building evidence, but it doesn't have to be all about the science either. It can be about evidence about what those people who already live in those places really love about their communities and their greenery. And some people will tell you that they hate it. There's nothing better than a street tree to bring out the full gamut of emotions about, you know, people that love them to death even when they're dead trees. But and the other extreme, you know, oh God, can't stand a bar of that. You know, that was something that my parents cleared the land and this is the way it's going to stay, or whatever other cultural background they come from. But you must start out with the evidence. You know, what do we already have? What do people like or don't like about that? And where are those people who are newcomers who are coming to live in those places? Where are they going to? And what are the particular needs of those places? You know, and yeah, the streetscape often needs to be rethought, and that's where, you know, streetscape guidelines, urban designers being involved in thinking about the street as a complete street, not just something that is something for cars to drive along. There's been a lot of great work in that space. You know, that streets can turn into being, you know, better for stormwater management. You know, they're the point source of pollution, so why not have the streets there and the trees in the street as being cleaners of the air and cleaners of the water that's going into the ground. So, you know, oh, well, that means that maybe, you know, we don't have to add that extra pipe diameter of grey infrastructure in that area where all those people are going to live. We can have, you know, a win-win here, you know, some greenery that looks great as well as on the job doing a whole lot of environmental things.
Do you have a comment, Tony? Oh, sorry, Steve. Tony.
Yes, I think aspirations, say, sound good, but often aren't worth very much. Aspiring to something, this is something politicians or even chief planning officers and things like to talk about, particularly in Australia, but they're often meaningless unless they're actually implemented. And all my experience being in Australia is that the implementation is the weak point. And people think, oh yes, they say, it's our aspiration, we want to achieve all these things. But are they actually going to make sure that every development actually complies? Often when I talk about this, and I talk about things I used to England, people say, oh, do you mean you'd actually tell the developers what to do? Oh, you say, do you mean you'd tell people how they're going to live in their house? I say, yes, that's what planning was invented for. That's what planning means. You actually require compulsorily. If you want the developer to put trees in, you make them. And in every development, they've got to do it. And if you want to preserve trees, you've got to stop people cutting them down. And it has to be implemented, and the examples there. And if that is the policy, then again, the roads department has got to not cut the trees. You've got to make sure all these people actually implement it. Yep. Because if you don't, I often find that is in Australia, that is where the weak point is. All these aspirations are never implemented in practice, and people often don't really take that very seriously or even in reality.
And that's why I mentioned the difference between tools and guidelines and compulsory. Development control plans are guidelines. You know, they'll be dismissed in court. You know, we encourage you to do this. It's not a requirement. Even standards. What should a local park have in it? Not just grass and colour-bond fencing and perhaps a sports field, but, you know, minimum number of X trees or percentage. Standards for streets. We don't accept streets that don't have a nature strip, don't have tree. What are those standards? So defining a bit more clearly and not resiling. Comments from council planners about, oh, we're not in the business of regulating design. You are. Who else is going to approve a new house, a new suburb, a new factory? That's exactly what you're doing.
Can I just make one comment too? In relation to tree haters, are there tree haters out there? Yes, there are. You know, have I met them? Yes, I have. Do you just give up on them? No, you don't. What I've found is that very often people who hate trees hate them for spurious reasons or because they've never actually been made to think about it, and they are in fact ignorant about it. And a classic example that many in this room have heard about the lady who killed off the street tree in front of her house, 3 trees in a row. And what she would do is the council would come along and plant, and on the day they planted, as soon as they were gone, they had the mulch around, she would pull the plant up so that the roots were out of the ground, and then she would put the mulch back around, and the tree would just die. and the council would be somewhat amazed at this, and then 6 months or a year later put in another one, and then no tree. And eventually I went down with a couple of people from the council and explained to her that there were now trees in the street was looking better, and that would add a significant value to her home. The next tree did wonderfully well. She watered it, she got it through the dry period, and it had never occurred to her that the tree that she had to sweep up a few things was adding value to her property. Another lady that I came across was furious about her neighbour's trees, forcing her to have her gutters cleaned one extra time per year from all the litter. And it was only when I pointed out that the shade in summer meant that she didn't have to turn her air conditioner on certain days, or for only an hour or two on other days, and that she was saving a truckload. And as a consequence of that, I went out and worked out how much she was saving. It was $180 a year off her electricity bill. And she never raised an issue about those trees with her neighbour again. Now, what this tells me is there are going to be some people who just hate trees, but a lot of it is because people don't see the benefits and the virtues. And I think Tim made a very valuable point. I certainly don't believe that every tree is worth saving. I've seen some absolute shockers, and when I see them not as trees at that point, but as opportunities for planting and for the future.
Okay. Is there a question there? Yes.
Andrew McKernan, Victorian Tree Industry. One of the common things that developers bring up is that trees are going to cause problems with foundations. People wanting trees removed justify foundation movement as a reason for removal. The Australian standard on house slab construction is written very much from a developer's perspective, not the tree's perspective. It gives the developers a choice of remove the trees or put down screw piles, which are very tree tolerant. I'd like some comment on whether you think maybe there should be a change to our building code and make screw piles in reactive clays compulsory, so that all houses are now built as tree friendly as opposed to tree intolerant.
Okay, I got something to say about this, and I've had a fair bit to do with this, and I was up in Sydney last year at the Footings Engineering sort of conference to give a talk, and the first thing I would say is screw piling is much more expensive, as you obviously know, but there's no reason why a properly constructed floating raft slab shouldn't be able to tolerate trees on a reactive clay. There is no reason at all. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm an arborist. I'm saying that because I've talked to the engineers about this at some considerable length. Now, the other thing I would say is you probably know that there are several thousand homes to the north of Melbourne where there are issues with slabs, and you may know that there are several thousand homes to the west of Melbourne where there are issues with slabs. I can tell you that one of the footings engineers, he's a geologist, but he consults as a footings engineer, in one of the ones up to the north of Melbourne, was asked, should they remove the trees? There were 12 of them growing along the side of the property, 12 trees, and his advice was that if you removed the trees, the cracking of the slab would be greater. Now, what happened was there are a whole lot of lazy designs done on these, what are called waffle or raft slabs, and they didn't run the thickened part of the construction across ways and long ways, particularly in L-shaped homes. And so I consider this to be one of the great sort of hospital handballs of all time for the Aussie Rules fans here. The building industry has done this shoddy work. The councils who are and their surveyors who are supposed to pick this up haven't picked up this bad design, and now they're looking for a scapegoat, and the tree is the obvious scapegoat. Problem is, in a lot of these places, they built these bloody houses, they built those slabs, there aren't any trees because they bulldozed them, and they're still cracking, and some of them are cracking worse because there are no trees compared to places where there are trees. So yes, you've got to fight on this. And the other thing I would say, the extra cost for doing a slightly thicker Rio and a little bit more concrete at the time of construction is between $500 and $1,000, depending on what sort of slab, what sort of steel. If you go up one grade from the standard reinforcing used in a house footing or slab, it costs you less than $500 on a $200,000 build, and you'll never have to worry about that slab cracking. And they don't do it because the whole thing is about greed and grabbing an extra buck. So I'm not prepared, from my perspective, to give an inch on this. It's an engineering problem. They know how to fix it, and it's all about cost. It's not to do with the plants.
Yes, if there's one major reform I'd like to see in Australia, it is a complete ban on concrete slab construction. I had never seen it before I came to Australia. It's hardly for houses, not other commercial buildings, but for private houses, it's almost unknown in my own country. I've never hardly seen it before. But also, I understand it is not traditional in Australia, certainly not in Queensland, where I live. The whole point about traditional houses in Queensland, they sat lightly on the ground on little posts. And that was... now, again, I am not convinced that it's necessarily actually saving money. I'd found, dealing with developers, again, back in England, a lot of the ways they do things, they claim it's for cost, but it's really, they never thought of anything else. And also, what is certainly now becoming the problem, certainly in Queensland, is that there's now most of it have done the concrete slabs as long. They don't know how to do anything else. They don't know how to do it differently. And again, as Greg was actually saying, Claire, what is so horrifying when you go to see these big new housing estates, particularly where there's hilly, is that they don't just remove the vegetation, they remove all the topsoil. And in fact, they start, and now particularly I've noticed in Western Australia where it's very sandy, they start to incur huge costs in earthworks to make a kind of big ziggurat thing. And so, and what is left, you can hardly grow anything. It is disastrous almost. And then with the runoff, the fact that there's no vegetation, no trees, this is a big problem when we had the floods back in Queensland. No one seemed to stop to ask why were all the horrifying pictures up in the hills, like Toowoomba, not on the floodplain. Why? Because all these hills that used to be covered in trees are now covered in these sort of concrete ziggurats, and in which you can't even grow there. So I think this is, people often, as with the traffic and everything, people get so used to this, then they say, oh, we've got this ancient tradition of concrete slabs that these new ideas of trees have got to give way to. But in fact, it's actually the other way around.
I think you're only as good as your substrate. I mean, I'm a New Zealander. I grew up in Wellington on a fault line where every house was timber and timber flexes and moves. And after Christchurch, they were talking for about 5 minutes, and just wait, it'll be overtaken by industry laziness and, cheapness, about new houses being built like matchsticks of laminated beams with rubber joints, so they move in every direction possible. And Christchurch is a swamp. I once went to a talk about Palazzi Veneziani, and Venice is a swamp where every house, masonry, marble or otherwise, sits on alder logs in a swamp. You're only as good as your substrate, and one standard does not work for all.
Ladies and gentlemen, one very quick one. I'm just about to call lunchtime, so don't take too...
Can you hear me? My name is Jason Summers. I'm from Hume City Council. I just wanted to talk about, we talked a bit about peri-urban areas, but I wanted to talk about creating the future history that we're going to protect. We're talking about past history, and I wanted to talk about the future, or how we create the new history in the future in these growing new suburbs. And one of the things that sort of not worries me, but as a parks manager, is the fact that we're not planting lots of new avenues of significance, or botanic gardens, or arboretums, or even forests in some of these places. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts for the panel about maybe what we need to be thinking about creating the next generation of history.
A couple of sentences each, please.
2 sentences, okay. But I mean, the positive signs I see, coming back to Melbourne after being away for a while, is things like in the City of Melbourne Council on there. And I think it is being driven by aspirations plus planning. I think you need the aspirations, you need to get people on side and take them with you. But then also you start to set yourself these goals of percentages and targets. And I would agree with you entirely. And I think it's such an exciting thing to plan, to dream and then to plan and to create parks, gardens and tree landscapes around the city. Why would you not do it, sir?
I think one of the things, Jason, is that we don't celebrate the creation of new things. If you look at the photos that have come up today, when people were planting, it wasn't some anonymous council worker that was sticking the tree in the ground. There was a bit of a fanfare and a recognition, and so the community took a fairly large stake in the success of the whole deal. So I think we should be getting people in and, you know, putting names on plaques and saying why we've done this particular planting, because I think it gives the community a stake. And that's what's protected our avenues of honour, the fact that the communities did it themselves and there was a stake in it. I also think you've got to look to your allies, and sometimes the allies are not the traditional ones. For example, I noticed that Tony's book has impacted on the Australian Cricket Board because they're worried about the lack of backyard cricket and what it's going to do for future Test cricket. Who'd have thought they were an ally? I know that TreeNet has approached the AFL about planting avenues of honours around football grounds. Who'd have thought the AFL might be, and Port Adelaide's taken it up. Who could believe Port Adelaide would do it? And the other one that I would say is, who's backing a lot of the green stuff in Victoria? The Department of Health. Whoever thought the Department of Health would be lobbying on our behalf? So get your allies and make use of them.